Okay, so welcome everyone. It's weird, I can't see the people online, but that's the downside. There's no way to totally to there's no way to meet all of our needs. But if we're talking to people,
to do a split screen.
Yeah, I'm gonna do it over here.
but we want people to be able to read
Yeah.
from the big screen. So yeah, I mean I can see. So well, do we want to all introduce ourselves briefly, since there are some new people, and I know who's got audio and who doesn't.
We don't have any cameras on at the moment.
Okay.
Actually, Joey and Loretta just turned theirs on, so let's go.
Okay,
Go to that
so
window.
Yes, absolutely. Let's introduce ourselves.
yes, and if you're not here, you can say where you are. I'm in a galaxy far, far away. No.
Only emotionally.
Okay, so why don't you, Marsha? Why don't you start? We'll go around the table, and then we'll go around the screen.
I'm Marcia Timmerman.
My name is Marty Kinyatic.
I'm Steve Nathan, Rabbi Steve Nathan, but Steve is fine.
Richard Timmerman.
Rachel Zane. Jane.
And here comes, who's coming up?
Barb Hoffman. And there's Wilma. Go ahead, Wilma.
Wilma Brucker.
And where are you? Are you here in Allentown? Okay.
Hi, Barb. Welcome. Anyone else? Loretta, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, sure. I'm Loretta Vitale and I'm in Silver Spring, Maryland.
Oh.
Okay.
Nice to be here.
And Hava is in Prince Edward Island. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Wonderful.
All right. And Barbara Hoffman is over there.
What? Yeah. Mom keeps trying to get to PEI.
Oh, you're muted, but that's okay. We know who you are. And who's the phone down in the corner?
That's Susan Schaefer.
Susan Schaefer's down there, and then who's up in the? Did Joey introduce himself? Joey, where are you calling in from?
Michigan.
Still?
Yeah.
Okay, and who's in the upper right-hand corner?
Carol Shazer.
Oh, okay.
Hello, Carol.
Hi, Carol. Driving. Oh, okay. We're in a car. Hopefully you're not driving. But all right. So we thought that this week would be a good week to talk about sort of the Jewish sources and Jewish texts connected to civil rights. As most of us, maybe all of us, are aware, there were Jews who were very involved in the civil rights movement from the beginning. Often, we talk about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who had a very close relationship with Dr. King. Actually was the person who convinced him to speak out against the war in Vietnam, which the African American community didn't want him to do because he felt it sort of muddled things. And it focused specifically on civil rights, but Heschel helped him realize that should do what he wants to do, and everybody, it's one of his more well-known speeches. And also, founders of NAACP, etc. And we could have looked at what's the history of Jews in the civil rights movement and how things have gone awry since then or changed since then, and that's a whole other topic, which actually those who are local, I should say, Rabbi Saul Levy, who is an African-American rabbi who lives here in Bethlehem, will be speaking at Lehigh some point in February on the growing up African-American and Jewish, but also talking about the relationship between the two, the Black and Jewish community, and what's happened to it, and how we might be able to go in a better direction. So I'll make sure that once we know the date on that, I'll make sure everybody knows. All right, but what I thought would be a good idea was to look at some of the roots and a couple of, I was going to focus more on contemporary texts, and then I realized it's really important to know where this comes from. I mean, we talk about the Jewish passion for social justice and civil rights, but it does, and sure, we talk about the Exodus from Egypt, and we talked about that the other night, but there are plenty of other reasons as well why civil rights and human rights are essential to Judaism. So I thought we would look through some biblical and rabbinic and then some contemporary texts. And obviously, as is always the case, we won't get to all of the texts that I've chosen, but that's always the case. So I thought it's always best to start with the Torah. Because we often think of the Torah as being specifically focused on the Jewish people, or at that point the Israelites, except at least once Abraham and Sarah come on the scene. Before then, it's much more universalistic. When we talk about Noah and pre-Abraham, Adam and Eve and Noah and all of those stories. But yes, it focuses on the Israelites, but also it talks about, never forgets the fact that human beings are all created in the image of God. It's not just Jews or Israelites who are created in the image of God. So I think it's, and then later on, the rabbis, you'll see how they sort of expand things. So I thought the best place to start, even though this is at the end of the Torah, this is really where it starts talking about, because Moses is talking to the people before they enter the land, talking about issues of human rights, civil rights, but we would use the word human rights at this point in time. So would somebody like to read the first text, Deuteronomy 4:9? I think it's big enough for everybody here to read, so if somebody either here or on screen wants to read 4:9.
I'll read it.
Okay.
But take utmost care and watch yourself scrupulously, so that you do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, and so they do not fade from your mind as long as you live, and make them known to your children and to your children's children.
Okay. So what's this referring to? What are the things that the people saw with their own eyes that they should never forget?
They saw the horrors of slavery
Right.
for themselves.
It's interesting because actually, supposedly, the slave generation has died off, but there's always that sense of there is no timeline. There is no later or earlier. Even today we'll say, well, we were slaves in Egypt. Well, we weren't, but we were. So, right. So the horrors of slavery, right? We know what that's like. So this idea of, it's not just saying remember, but take utmost care and watch yourselves scrupulously. Why those particular words? Obviously, it's the translation, but why do you think it's phrased in that particular way?
Because it's easy to fall into the patterns of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
I'm more powerful than you are, therefore you will do my bidding.
Okay, it's easy to fall into the patterns, definitely. What else is it easy to do?
Kind of black and white thinking, like you're saying.
Yeah.
And also being oppressive of the next person behind you. Like if you are entering the new promised land, just because you got there, don't judge the people around you.
Mm-hmm.
And judging others can really lead to some negative things.
And at the heart of that, I think, is forgetting. It's so easy. Once you forget, it's so easy to repeat or to fall into the same patterns, the same oppressive patterns.
One of the things that, because you see about your children, your children's children, so your behavior is watched by your children and your grandchildren.
Right.
So if you have poor behavior, it's going to affect how they look at things.
Right.
So that's why you want to watch yourself scrupulously, because your children and grandchildren are watching.
Right. We're responsible for the upcoming generations. And it's not only children and grandchildren, but it's the children and grandchildren of the whole society. You may never have children, but it's still, we're responsible for for the next generation, for teaching them the right way, and for making sure that they don't forget. Then, yeah.
Isn't this also, I mean, at this point, we know that we're going to go to the promised land,
Right.
which means that we're either gonna be at war or do something to the people that are there. So we need to be scrupulous about our behavior.
Yeah. And when you think about it, it's actually probably written long after we got to the promised land, and probably written in exile. So it's about sort of thinking back to the past and the future and the present. You know, we always need to be scrupulous. And then the next verse, Tzedek, Tzedek, Tirdov, justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So why the duplication, why that repetition, do you think, of the word justice, Tzedek? Oomph, emphasis.
Yeah.
Well, there's no way to say really, really in Hebrew, so very often the Hebrew word is repeated.
Yeah.
To-
True, true. That was not intentional. It really wasn't. But that is true. Even today, we repeat things for emphasis. But also, you know, there are a lot of interpretations of that. And one of my favorites is, you know, justice. We have to work for justice when we feel like it and when we don't feel like it, when it's convenient and when it's inconvenient. We can't just say, oh, that's not gonna, you know, that's not for me, or let somebody else handle it this time. You know, we always, whether or not we really want to do it, we have to do it. So it's an imperative, but right, using a repetition. And then much later in the prophets, somebody want to read the verse from Micah?
God has told you, O human, what is good and what the eternal requires of you, only to do justice and to love goodness and to walk modestly with your God.
So what's so important about that particular verse? Thinking in terms of human rights and civil rights and just being human.
It puts it almost like a higher priority. Like, we are emphasizing these few things. Yes, you have to do a lot, but these trump. These are constant, eternal viewpoints.
You know, it's not saying God has told you what you should do, which is, you know, obey all the mitzvot, although that's implied, because all of these things sort of run, at least underlying the whole system of mitzvot. But, you know, what is really, you know, what's required of us ultimately is, again, we talked about justice, you know, tzedek, righteousness, justice. Why those three particular things, do you think? It's not just, you know, do justice or righteousness. And that's, you know, translation is interesting because tzedek can mean justice or righteousness. And they do have different connotations in English. But why those three things?
I want to focus on the work modestly with your God.
Mhm.
That focus that we as Jews focus on the humanity of ourselves. Like, we know we ain't perfect. And we know we are never going to be perfect.
Right.
So there's that focus on, you know, no matter what we do, acknowledge the fact that we didn't get it 100% right, and God doesn't always get it 100% right.
Right.
We're both kind of working modestly with each other.
And it's interesting because often this gets translated as humbly, but hatsnea, which is the word, it's come from it's the same root as tzniut, which is the practice of modest dress. So humility and modesty are not quite the same, but right, this idea of, you know, we talked about this Friday night for those who were here, sort of, you know, I am not worthy, but sometimes look who, there's an old joke, I can't think of the whole thing, but it's, everybody's saying they're not worthy, and somebody says, look who thinks he's not worthy. It's like sometimes saying you're not worthy is just another way of puffing yourself up and bragging. But this is saying, really you have to do justice. You have to do what's right and what's good. Two are not always synonymous, but hopefully they are. And to do it in a humble way. We talked, those who were here Friday night, we talked about Moses and, sort of the greatest leaders have been humble, even though they still have to, let's face it, they still have an ego,
Yeah.
And you have to in order to survive what you go through. And if you look at, we talked about Dr. King or even Moses and how he's portrayed in the Torah. I mean, they went through a lot, so they have to have some kind of strength, or ego in contemporary terms, but still you have to be modest and humble as well. So let's flip to the next screen.
I had one thing to
Oh
say
yeah,
about
Barbara, yeah.
the humility. Above the ark in many congregations, maybe not all, but it usually says know before whom you stand, and that's about
Right.
humility. And that's why we wear something on our head.
Right. So know
humility.
before whom you stand. So how does that about, I agree it's about humility. How would you say that's about humility?
How would I say it's about
Yeah.
humility? Well, when there was always well, I can't say a being or an entity. There's always an essence
Mm-hmm.
that's bigger than we are.
Mm-hmm.
No matter what we do, no matter how great we think we are, or how great we think the work of our hands is, there's something better than that. There's something bigger than that.
Right.
Stop and put yourself in proportion.
Right. Whether
Yeah.
one views God, as you said, sorry, go ahead, Barbara.
It makes us right-sized.
Yeah. Whether one views God in the traditional sense as some kind of a greater being, or whether it's a force of the universe or nature or whatever, it's always something greater than ourselves. There was a Christian saint, I can't remember who it was, is that, God is that which nothing greater can be imagined. Yeah, that didn't come out quite right, but same thing. There's something out there that is greater than everything else. And even scientifically, we could say that there's some kind of a force out there that's greater than ourselves. Yes.
But we're always encouraged, and the Torah is full of instances where our leaders, heroes, whatever, have fought with God, and
Yeah.
argued with God,
Mhm.
and the God in Genesis isn't really
Mm-hmm.
a God that you want to follow completely.
Right, that's true too. And that's like I always like to say, we talk about God being human beings being created in the image of God. My feeling is that, when the authors of the Torah, who I do believe were human beings, they created God in the image of human beings. They wanted to make God relatable to give us lessons. So if we are, because, so we are created in the image of God. God is created in our image. We have to be godly. We have to try and be godly, but also realize that part of being godly means also making questionable choices, even though God is still seen as being perfect. So there's sort of that tension there. Amos, a later prophet. This is a verse that's used in the prayer for peace. I think both the Reconstructionist and the Conservative Siddur, maybe the Reform as well. I haven't been to a Reform service in a while. Who would like to? And also Reverend King used this verse. He used a lot of verses from the prophets, because the prophets were always. And I realized I didn't really focus as much on the prophets here, because I think so much of what I taught through the years about Reverend King has been about the prophets, so I wanted to make sure we went. And it did beyond that. because it's easy to just focus on the same things each year. But I think it's very important to know that, the prophets were essential to King and King's message. One of the quintessential books on the prophets was Abraham Joshua Heschel's book, The Prophets, which actually was his doctoral dissertation, originally written in German, and then he translated it. But this idea, this is sort of a little bit of an aside, but not totally, because when asked in an interview, when Dr. Heschel was asked in an interview, do you think we have modern prophets today? Do we think we have prophets today? Who did he name as a prophet? King. He said, that's the only name that came to mind at that time, was that King was a prophet. So what is a prophet? Sometimes we think of prophet in terms of prophecy, prophecy of the, for the future, telling you how things are going to be, or that they can see the future. But that's not what the prophets do. What do the prophets do?
They speak to the current situation.
They speak to the current situation, right?
Truth to power.
Truth to power. Do they talk about the future?
In Judaism, there's always that chain. What you're doing now will affect the next generation.
Right.
You were saying before, like the parenting passing forward and everything. So it's
Mhm.
in some ways there's always that view of us in a timeline.
Right. It's
King talks about what can be.
exactly. Here's what can be. So that's part of it. If you do what you're supposed to do, here's what will happen. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, here's what will or might happen. And that's really what the prophets are about. We're telling the people, usually when things are going wrong, that the prophets are not following God, or not following, the other things that we just read. Then they're saying, okay, listen, this is what's going to happen if you don't change your evil ways.
Yeah. I was saying prophets are the messengers of the divine.
Right. And the message that they're giving is not, it's not, Long Island Medium telling you here's what's going to happen. It's saying, yeah, here's what's going to happen if, it's interesting because we talk about, in the Torah, say about, well, see, we knew this was going to happen. Well, no, actually it's because it was written later, sort of projecting it back. When the prophets are writing, they're writing in their time, and they're saying, you guys are doing this. You need to change. You need to do things differently, or this is what's going to happen. This is what God wants of you, and that's what Dr. King was all about. And so let's look at Amos, later prophet. If somebody want to read. Okay.
Hate evil and love good, and establish justice in the gate. Spare me the sound of your hymns, and let me not hear the music of your lutes, but let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream.
Okay, so first let's just look at that. So often that last verse is what gets included, even I think it's in the speech on at Lincoln Monument, where he says, "Let justice will well up like water, and righteousness like a mighty stream." Right.
And hate evil, love good, and establish justice in the gate is often, but they skip the center section, and I thought that was really interesting.
It's fascinating. Yeah, I had forgotten about that myself. What's essential about that verse 23?
It's all about how you should not be just talking the talk. You've got to actually do it.
Right.
You know, the more you sing about it, the more you play about it, it becomes less action and more talk, and you need more action.
Yeah. And I just think of something that a friend of mine who's I don't know how he would define himself, post-evangelical. He grew up very evangelical. He's a queer evangelical minister, Brandon Robertson. Some of you may have seen him when he was here a few years ago at Bradbury Sullivan. And he just posted a piece yesterday about why he thought that, or recently, about why in his view, Trump is the Antichrist. But part of what he talks about too is, you know, in the evangelical world, people are singing and dancing and praising God, and yet they're supporting somebody who is antithetical to everything that's taught in the Bible, right? And at least I feel that way. I think most of us, if not all of us, feel that way. But but this idea about it's, you know, hymns are nice, music is nice, but don't give me that if you're not going to be doing the work. Yeah, I mean, Isaiah said, if you look at the, sorry, go ahead.
No,
I was just saying,
Oh,
sorry,
yeah,
you need the meat, the substance.
the Haftorah on Yom Kippur, where, you know, Isaiah talks about, is, you know, the fast, you know, what I want from a fast. It's not just, you know, tearing your, you know, sitting in sackcloth and ashes and bowing your head and not eating. It's about, okay, what it's supposed to do is tell you what the fast is supposed to urge you on to do other things. So I don't care if you know, if you don't eat all day on Yom Kippur and then you go out and cheat somebody the next day. I mean, he basically says that. I didn't include that particular text, but it's very much there in the Haftarah of Yom Kippur. So the same thing, right? That it's not just about hating evil and loving good, and if you do this, justice will well up like water and righteousness like a mighty stream or unfailing stream, that it's, you know, that it washes over the universe. But, you know, that's what I want. I don't care if you sing or not, you know, in the end, if you're not going to be doing that, if you're not going to be doing this other stuff. Any comments on the screen there?
Anybody can unmute if they like.
Okay, I thought this was an interesting text that I came across, and thank God for Sefaria. Sefaria, if you don't know Sefaria, you should definitely check it out, sefaria.org. And a lot of times they, you know, they'll have a page with you put in a text, the topic, and it'll list, you know,
A little one.
oh, there's a little one there.
Hello. Sleepy
The you know, Safari a lot of times will give you the sources, and it's like there's no need to reinvent the wheel, but then you just have to know what the sources are about. So a lot of this did come from Safaria. So I never thought of looking at the story of Esther in terms of civil rights, human rights, communal rights. So this is, well, let's read the text and you tell me if you can figure out what the context is here. Who would like to read it?
can I read that one too? When Mordecai was told what Esther had said, Mordecai had this message delivered to Esther. Do not imagine that you, of all the Jews, will escape with your life by being in the king's palace. On the contrary, if you keep silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from another quarter, while you and your father's house will perish. And who knows, perhaps you have attended to royal position for just such a crisis.
So context, what is what's happening here?
After Haman has decided that he's going to kill all the Jews,
Right.
and Esther was asked by Mordecai to do something about it. And Esther goes, oh, but I could be killed for doing something about it. And he goes, yeah, but you could be killed for not doing something about it too.
Exactly.
Basically. But
So,
I love this line here. Don't imagine that you will escape. On the contrary, if you are silent in this crisis, relief and deliverance will come to our people from another area, while you and your father's house will perish.
Right.
So
Right.
there's faith that it's gonna happen, but it very much we're all handed our part and
Right.
whatever the world to come is getting like, and this was her being handed, I'm sorry, but this is your lot.
Yeah.
And step up or not.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing to me here, because it's sort of what, it reminds me of what Joseph says to his brothers when he reveals himself, and they're worried that he's gonna seek vengeance, which he kind of has been, the whole, playing with them and taking Benjamin for prisoner and all that. But what he basically says is, listen, don't worry. This is what I was meant to do, which is so this idea of, and I think in Joseph's case, it does say that I was part of God's plan, and God is mentioned specifically. So, which is interesting, and so that's saying, and the idea of sort of God as the puppet master, or the chess master moving us around, whereas here God is not even mentioned in Megillah Esther, right? God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. But of course, according to the traditional way of looking at it, God is still in the background. So in some ways it's saying here, okay, if you don't do something, somebody else will. Is that saying that God will make it happen, or is it saying there are good people in the world who are going to make a difference, and if you don't do it, somebody else is going to step up to the plate? And could that actually take you off? Well, no, it couldn't take you off the hook, except in saying you're going to die if you don't do it.
Yeah.
So
And a
it's,
lot of other people will too.
and a lot in your whole family, right? But how does this apply to say?
Almost
Remember,
implies
yeah.
that the Jews may survive, but you and your dad won't.
Right.
It'll somehow delay the process. There will be more hardship unless you step up and do.
And if you look at this in a more universal sense, also, if you think in terms of, this is my twist on it, because it's really not in there, because this really was specifically talking about the Jews, but it's like, don't think that if you're not helping other people who are oppressed, that you're still going to be safe. You're still somebody else is going to save them, and you might end up being the ones who are oppressed, or you might be the ones who are killed. It can be taken in a more universal sense, even though that wasn't the meaning of the text.
Yeah, Ahava was saying Esther's hiding who she is, and hiding who she is will not protect her.
Right. And it's interesting. This is taking it again. This is in a different direction, but when we can hide who we are, and when we've talked about this before. As Jews, when we think about anti-Semitism today, which is a slightly different direction, we can hide who we are for the most part. Okay, people of color, not so much. Although we all know of cases of people who are very light-skinned who do pass, and especially in the past, we know all of these stories. But in general, they don't have the same. I don't want to say the word luxury, but you know what I mean, of being able to hide who they are. And this is saying here, even when you hide, and right, Esther is a play on the word hester, which is to hide. That even when you hide, eventually you're going to be found out, or something's going to happen, and so don't try and get out of your responsibility to your people, whether it's specifically your people in this case, or your people being everybody, because it's still, you're still required to help.
And the march of justice is coming, like it's saying,
Yeah.
it will come from another corner, but
Mhm.
So I got a
the arc
question.
of the universe.
When
Yes.
is the Pirkei Avot written?
Pirkei Avot is Mishnah, so that is finished around 200, give or take.
And Esther comes from,
Esther is earlier.
okay, interesting, because this reminds me of the Pirkei Avot, which
Yes.
is, it is not your duty to finish the work, but neither is it, are you at liberty to neglect it,
Right. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor.
Mhm.
right? And
Right.
that's
Mhm.
basically what he's saying to her is,
Yeah.
you might not be the only one that's working on this, but you can't sit there and not do anything.
Right.
Mhm.
You
I actually
can't
meant
be
to put that text in here and I forgot to. So thank you for mentioning it.
And it just struck me, it's like,
Mhm.
here's these two time periods where you're looking at the same idea of,
Yeah.
you know, you can sit there and not say anything,
Mm-hmm.
but that's not gonna solve the problem. You've got to get off your butt and say something when you
Right.
see wrong.
Right.
Your part is.
Right.
That might be just all your part is
Right.
to
Right.
say something when you see
Mhm.
wrong happening.
And again, even if you think you're not going to be able to finish the work, that doesn't mean you're free to
Yeah.
just not do it.
Every little bit.
Mhm.
Right. So let's jump to the next text.
I
Yeah,
see a
go
lot
ahead.
of parallels between Esther and Moses at the burning bush. But prior, I mean, he ran away from Egypt, he
Yeah.
Yeah.
chose not to do that, and he said, why me? You know, I'm not
Right,
capable of doing
right.
it. Different circumstances, but parallel.
Yeah.
And the reluctant prophet too. I mean, you have that with Jonah, right? He literally tries to run away and get
Yeah.
swallowed by the big fish, whale, whatever you want to call it. And whenever I hear the whale, I still think of Pinocchio. So, but which is actually,
Sure.
Pinocchio. That is sort of a riff on the
Yeah,
Jonah
it is.
story, in a way. Although, anyway, but he, that he tries to run away, and there are other prophets too that are shown as being.
Jeremiah.
Jeremiah is another perfect
Yeah.
example.
So it's a constant thread of
Yeah.
you have something to do and you will do it.
I mean, listen, even Dr. King or other contemporary prophets, it's, it's scary. I mean, because
It
you're
is
taking
scary.
your life in your hands. I mean, he knew that he was, that he might be killed. I mean, that
His
was
speech
not,
the night before was prophetic in
yeah,
scary
Mhm.
scary ways.
yeah. That's very
That always
true.
brings tears to my eyes.
So, but that's I think another reason why he does focus on the prophets so much is because, they're not out, they are out there delivering the message in a very strong way, but they also realize that they may not be listened to, they may be killed, they are reluctant,
Human
and
fear.
they're right, they're human. And as opposed to Moses, who also was reluctant, but was Moses a historical figure? I don't know. I'll just put it that way. I don't know, but we know that the prophets were historical figures. We know that they actually did exist, and they because it was they took place in a time where history was being kept by the Jewish people, which is why I question. I don't know, this whole other area, but the veracity of some of the earlier stories, because histories were being kept when Moses was supposedly around, and we haven't found any evidence yet outside of the Torah. But I digress. Let's go on to the next text. So we're in the rabbinic text. So again, Babylonian Talmud finished around 600 CE. So just to remind folks, so the Mishnah was the first set of commentaries on the Torah, and that was finished around the year 200. And then the Talmud, there's the Jerusalem Talmud, which ended earlier because the community, everybody ended up in Babylonia. So the Babylonian Talmud is sort of the more authoritative text, because that is finished, that continues. It's more commentaries on commentaries, and that finishes around 600. So this is somewhere, in that time period. But so this is again talking about our responsibility to the greater good. So would somebody online want to read this one?
Yeah, I'll read it.
Okay.
Anyone who is able to protest against the transgressions of one's household and does not is punished for the actions of the members of the household. Anyone who is able to protest against the transgressions of one's townspeople and does not is punished for the transgression of the townspeople. Anyone who is able to protest against the transgressions of the entire world and does not is punished for the transgressions of the entire world. Yikes.
Yeah.
A missed opportunity is guilt.
Right. And it is kind of, well, it's a not quite what goes around comes around, but in some way it is. You know, if you don't, well, what do people think of this? I mean, does it make sense?
It flies in the face of you're not your brother's keeper, but at the same time, it's not saying you have to do something necessarily, but you have to voice it.
Right. You have to raise your voice in protest. And even, you know, is it, if you're looking at it in a more supernatural, traditional God view, like, well, God is going to get you if you don't protest. But also, if you look at it in a more naturalistic or humanistic point of view, if you don't protest what's happening that's wrong, it's going to come back to bite you. You're going to end up, you know, if we don't protest against prejudice and hatred of all kinds in our society, right, and in our world and in our household, you know, it keeps getting bigger and bigger. Eventually, it may come back. You know, we might be able to escape it. Let's face it, some people do. But this thing, eventually, it's going to come back to bite you. It's going to come back to get you. And maybe that's, you know, even it could be in the next world. Again, Judaism doesn't focus on that as much, but it's there. You know, so and I love the fact that, you know, it's not after you read it, you said, yikes. Like, you know, it's not just about your household. It's not just about your town. It's about the entire world, which is a bit, you know, back then the world was a lot smaller.
Yeah.
And in other ways, it was, I mean, yeah, now it's a lot larger, but in some ways it's smaller because we do have connection to more places in the
So
world.
it implies that if you don't do anything, you're gonna get the same punishment as the evil community.
Right. I mean, yeah.
Ahava was saying, it's imperative calling it out always. Babylonian Talmud Sota 11a, Ayov, who was silent, was punished by suffering.
Right. So that's right.
And
So
it's-
Eov is Job. So
Oh.
so yeah. And that there's more to that in terms of the interpretation. But right, if you don't do something about it, you are going to suffer. And again, this goes back to the Esther text too. It's like, don't think you're going to get out of it.
Yeah.
And again, but it's not saying you have to. You know, again, we're going back to the Pirkei Avot text. You know, doesn't mean we're gonna finish the work, but doesn't mean we're free to just not do it at all, or at least to protest.
And it also implies that we're not necessarily, you are not necessarily, we're not just dependent on you to fix it. There's the Esther quote sort of says there's other, you know, God doesn't lay all of his eggs in one basket. Like,
Right.
you know, like there's not just one person who's involved in fixing the problem. You've got there are other people out there working on this, but you can't not do your part.
Right. And if your part is even just, you know, sometimes does protesting do any good? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But
When I was in
Something
high
to-
school, everybody was, Amnesty International was really big when I was in high school, and it was like this huge thing. Everybody was required to, like, you know, financially not support a company or do all these things like writing letters and stuff like that. And a lot of people think now that that was a waste of time, and I'm like, no, I don't think so. I don't think that, you know, the fact that no synagogue will have Pepsi products on the Oneg is necessarily.
now they will,
but back then they wouldn't.
because they sold it in the Soviet
Because they
Union.
sold it to the Soviet Union, and they sold to Arab markets, and they wouldn't sell to
Or
Israel.
the Nestle's boycott and
All the boycotts that we did back then, they meant something. I mean, even the bus boycott that Martin Luther King did. I mean, they're challenging and they're financial, but
right.
a lot of people thought that that was silly to say, you know, we're not going to do this, but it does let the company know that there is an issue in the market, and it does change the way that they think about marketing.
Right.
Every
Right.
tiny little action adds up, and it's,
Hmm.
this is your, you just, you get a
This is
wave
your
out
way
of a
of-
million
yeah.
drops, you know,
Yeah.
it's.
I mean, I think of, the when I was in college and, the whole the boycott of South Africa was taking place, and it worked. It certainly was part of what worked.
Well, you're seeing it in the modern day, although not in the good sense, but with Anheuser-Busch, because of the gay rights, the
Mhm.
transgender rights.
It can work in both directions, unfortunately. That's why when you see things like that, then you have to also fight back, because if some people may think that they are boycotting or taking actions for the right thing, when in actually, at least from our perspective, in this case, let's say it's not the right thing. So we need to, it's like when we see people boycotting a certain, Anheuser-Busch or whatever, I wish they had better beer, but
Right.
you have to try and support them in whatever way you can.
Yeah.
So
Money talks.
yeah.
Money does.
And sometimes it's not only about, right, sometimes it is about money, and sometimes it's about, our actions and what we say. Let's go to the next text, which is, sorry.
I'm just constantly reminded of the poem or the letter or whatever it was written by, I believe it was a Catholic priest about the Nazis, where he went through the whole litany of, I didn't protest when they.
oh, that was Martin Niemöller. He was Protestant.
Okay.
Protestant, yeah.
But, the final line is, and then they came for me.
Right. A text that gets used and misused by so many people. Years ago, I knew his widow, his second wife, who was much younger than he. She had actually been a friend of his daughter, but so many years younger. And she used to hate how that somehow got misused by certain people or misquoted. But right, the reason it does get quoted so much. It's like, yeah, you can keep hiding if they come for everybody else, but eventually if you don't, they're gonna come for you. This text continues on the next page. It's still part of the same text. So this is talking about the beginning part. I'm not worried about as much the house of the Exilarch, who was the communal authority in the Babylonian exile. So the person who was in charge of the government of the Jewish community in exile. They were punished for, that because they didn't fight back, they were eventually punished, as it says before, for the transgressions of the entire world. But what I wanted to focus on here is the text interpretation of this Isaiah verse. So Isaiah says God will bring judgment on the elders and the officers of the people. And so the officers being the leaders, the politicians, the elders being the communal elders, what have they done? But the main thing is the verse signifies that God brings judgment on the elders for not having protested against the transgressions of the officers, right? They may not have done the evil acts, may have been committed by the officers, by the government, but the elders, the communal leaders, got punishment because they didn't protest, right? So it's sort of an extension of, it's also, now we're talking about not only the communal responsibility in general, but we're talking about the responsibility of the leaders of the community too, not just the elected officials, right? So, we're thinking about whether it's rabbis or teachers or heads of nonprofits or whatever, that it's incumbent upon the people in general, but also the people who are sort of leading them, the people that are being looked up to, right? Any other thoughts about that particular?
Just to comment on the term exilarch, correct me if I'm wrong. The exilarchs were the people who purported to be from the lineage of the high priest. And that's how they got their role in Babylon.
Yeah, and it's questionable sometimes whether they were. But,
yeah, right. Yeah, how do you prove that?
Yeah, exactly. You You wanted to say something else? Ev?
Yeah, so I think we saw this during after the Holocaust, how the communities around these crematoriums, whatever, they didn't know what was going on. They brought the leaders. I didn't know this was going on. It's that's one of the first things that you have a responsibility if the leaders are doing it, if the government's doing it, you're not allowing them. You have a complicity.
Right.
There were some US Army units that came up with people said we didn't know what's going on. So they lined the people up and sent them through the crematoriums
To show them.
and
Yeah.
rotting bodies that were laying there and said, how can you not know about this?
But this, and also thinking about in terms of civil rights, it's like if it's not just the government, yes, but the government's sometimes not going to do what's right, and it's up to the leaders of the community and the people of the community to really fight for what's right and to, that's when we think about
It's not just.
Silence is violence.
right,
Yeah.
silence is violence, and this Babylonian Talmud Ta'anit 11a text, at a time when the community is suffering, no one should say, I will go home, eat, drink, and be at peace with myself. Right?
We're not free until every one of us is free.
Right, we're not free until every one of us is free. And we think back to, again, it was very easy for people in the time of the civil rights struggles in the 50s and 60s to say, well, and again, this is talking about the community more specifically in the Jewish community, but I think, again, we can expand that to, well, I'm just going to go home and take it, because this isn't affecting me, right? And nobody can be at peace with themselves when people are suffering, which is, I think, is a very powerful statement. Any questions about, is there a comment on the screen?
No, okay.
Oh, okay. So again, you can see where Dr. King, who was knowledgeable on a lot of this stuff, even if it wasn't from his particular tradition, I think he was knowledgeable, but also, it shows you how so many of the texts that we learn that are specific to the Jewish people really also applies to the entire world. If we look at the next text, so Ibn Ezra was a medieval commentator, and he's commenting on Leviticus. So yeah, I mean that he's basically just saying there that don't get involved with people who shed blood, even if again, and so we're talking about don't stand idly by the blood of your neighbors. Okay, so that particular text is really just saying if somebody's involved in spilling the blood, literally or figuratively, of others, you can't just stand by. But I want to look actually more at the Sanhedrin quote. Somebody want to read that?
From where it is derived that one who sees another drowning in a river, or being dragged away by a wild animal, or being attacked by bandits, is obligated to save him? The Torah states, you shall not stand idly by the blood of another. The Gemara answers, yes, it is indeed, so that this verse relates to the obligation to save one whose life is in danger.
Right, so how does that apply to civil rights? The civil rights struggle.
How can you go home and be at peace when somebody else is?
Yeah, and they were absolutely in danger. The lynchings and that was the word I was looking for,
And
the low hanging fruit.
And
Just
one
in
per-
continuous poverty.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah.
Systemic oppression.
Right, right.
One friend said, existential pain is just as bad.
Yeah,
It's the suppression of a community in, now we know how it carries forward in our physiology, but in the mental perspective of a people that has been through untold horrors,
right.
it's affected for a long time.
And some, it's interesting how, when we're talking about lynchings, and things like that, it's how you look at it. For instance, like there are postcards
Mm-hmm.
of lynchings.
Yep.
That
Souvenirs.
right?
It was cruel.
There were picnics.
Cool.
There were,
Right.
so the
Yeah.
knowledge of what's happening can go either way. Like they knew exactly what was happening, and that was perfectly fine. They were celebrating it. But we, our tradition teaches, and the rabbinic tradition and the prophetic tradition, says no. If you know what's happening, it makes me think of, if we're talking about lynchings, probably one of the most powerful songs ever written, "Strange Fruit." It wasn't Billie Holiday sang it. It was written by Abel Meeropol, who was, among other things, the man who adopted the Rosenbergs' son. Son was more than one, I can't remember now. And he was a school teacher, and he was writing out of the Jewish tradition very much. That you can't just stand by when blood on the leaves, blood at the root. You can't just and you can't just stand idly by. And I think of also Emmett Till and what his mother did by saying, we're not going to have a closed casket here because I want the country to see what's happening.
Yeah.
And yet we know that there were people who probably were celebrating,
Well, that's sort of a corollary of what you were talking about at the very beginning, about the problems with slavery, and you shouldn't forget. It's not just the oppressors who shouldn't forget, but you shouldn't be a willing slave because somebody tells you this is the right thing.
Right.
You can't just do it because you're told.
Yeah.
You can't just abdicate your responsibility and say, it's not my
Well, I was in the South in the 60s in the Army, and when I talked to people, I said, "Why are you doing this stuff?" And he said, "You're a Yankee, you don't understand."
Yeah.
As if human rights are different depending on your geographical location.
Like I'm a foreigner.
Yeah.
You gotta understand our customs before you can comment.
Yeah. Let's go to the next page. So this is Maimonides, as quoted and commented on a little bit by Nechama Leibovich. Nechama Leibovich being a 20th century scholar in Israel. Maimonides, 12th century, Palestine, Spain, mostly Spain, but also Palestine and Egypt, philosopher, legal expert. It's interesting. Everybody seems to want to claim Maimonides as their own. Probably one of the most, if not the most prolific writer in the Jewish tradition. So again, we're talking about lo ta'amod, do not stand idly by, al dam l'reacha, do not stand idly by the blood of your neighbor, is what the full quote is from Genesis. So somebody want to read this Maimonides quote? Okay, thanks.
Everyone who can save a person but does not violates the mitzvot of lo ta'amod, do not stand idly by. Whether they actually witness the other person in danger, or whether he or she could have hired others to do the rescue and did not, or perhaps she heard idol worshippers, people outside the Jewish community, planning an attack and did not warn the potential victim, or if he or she knew of a threat against his or her fellow and could have pacified the threat on behalf of the other and did not. Any similar situation, all these people would have violated lo ta'amod.
So sort of bracketing the whole comment on idol worshipers, because again, one has to think about when and where Maimonides was speaking. But so I think, you know, people outside of the community or people who are transgressing the norms of the community is sort of how I would like to look at it, because it's not just people outside the Jewish community. Okay, if we're looking at it in a more global sense, what's the basic essence of this text though saying? Sort of fits in with what we've been talking about earlier as well.
You're just as guilty if you're watching it, not doing anything, as
Mhm.
if you're doing it yourself.
Right. Is there such a thing as an innocent bystander? I mean, sometimes yes, but I think a lot of people who claim to be innocent bystanders were just turning the other direction. You know, it's interesting, you know, even if you witness it yourself, or even if you could have hired somebody else to do the rescue and didn't, you know, if we're not out there helping the organizations that are trying to end
Or see something.
slavery.
911.
Right.
Yeah.
Simple.
Right.
You involve yourself in much.
But it's, so again, it's talking about all of our responsibility to the community. Again, it may not have originally have been, it was specifically talking about the Jewish community here, but again, I think the same concept is there for us today, is that, you know, if we don't do something to fight against the threat or to save people who can be saved, then we're just sailing idly by the blood of our neighbors.
Used in a different context, but that's where we are today with the line, see it, say something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like we were saying before about how there's that know before whom you stand, that pause and stop and keep ourselves, like we were saying, smaller than the whole. There's something greater and above us.
Right.
But as we are down here, we are the same. Like we have to expand our boundaries horizontally to include all of humanity and everyone suffering. And it's as if it's us, because it is.
Right. So I wanted to just jump ahead to some more recent texts. Actually, go to the one after this. I should really put them in different order. The Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, 19th century Germany, that's sort of the father of modern Orthodoxy. You know, and he's basically saying, I'm just going to sort of cherry pick different parts of this verse. This quote, you know, your mission is not limited by the walls of your house. Beyond their limits, you must assist with every particle of your strength wherever it is necessary to save the life, the property, or the happiness of a human being. You know, so again, he goes more and more into this, that again, you have to be a blessed, he ends up saying, be a blessing whenever and wherever you can. It's not just limited by the walls of your house. It's not just limited by your own community, right? You have to do all these different mitzvot, feeding the hungry, consoling the mourning, healing the sick, etc. It's for everybody. Okay, we have to take care of everybody, whether or not they are in our own house, and that's sort of part of the modern Orthodoxy and the other movements that grew up in the 18th, 19th century, was that, you know, we're part of a larger community. So for the Jewish community, I think that's, you know, it's important to note that it's not just something that's coming out of the progressive community or the more liberal community. This is, you know, like I said, he's the father of modern Orthodoxy. So now if we jump back a page though, you know, it's interesting, my friend and colleague, Rabbi Sandra Lawson, an RRC Reconstructionist Rabbinical grad, the first, I think, queer woman of color, queer women of color to be ordained as a rabbi, I believe, and very much involved in. She now works for the Reconstructionist movement in terms of diversity and equity work. And you know, she likes to say, you know, everybody talks about Heschel and King. There's so much more than Heschel and King, and it's true. But also, I think it's important to look at what what Rabbi Heschel did have to say as sort of one of the prophets of our tradition in the 20th century, who unfortunately died very young. One has to wonder what he would say if he was around today. Actually, I think his daughter, Susanna, who's a professor at Dartmouth, is talking today about his heritage, legacy, and what he would be saying today. But somebody want to read this? Again, this is 1963, so he's specifically talking about religion and race. And again, he was very close with Dr. King. So somebody want to read this?
I'll read.
Okay.
Modern and contemporary. Okay. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, Religion and Race, 1963. There is an evil which most of us condone and are even guilty of: indifference to evil. We remain neutral, impartial, and not easily moved by the wrongs done unto other people. Indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself. It is more universal, more contagious, more dangerous. A silent justification, it makes possible an evil erupting as an exception becoming the rule and being in turn accepted. The prophet's great contribution to humanity was the discovery of the evil of indifference. One may be decent and sinister, pious and sinful. However, an honest estimation of the moral state of our society will disclose some are guilty, but all are responsible.
Perhaps the most quoted, cited quote of Rabbi Heschel, that some are guilty, but all are responsible. So what's, what is the essence of what he's saying here, which I think was very much part of Dr. King's message as well, in terms of our responsibility outside of those who aren't part of the African American community. Or if even, what is not part of a community? Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. But we're not only talking about our own community, right? We're talking about other communities. What's at the essence here?
That we can't be silenced. We have to open our mouths when, things are being done that are terrible, and
Right.
say this is wrong.
Right. That indifference to evil is more insidious than evil itself because it's more contagious. To say actually doing evil, killing another person, oppressing another person might be more difficult to do, but the more that you just turn your back to it, the more it becomes the norm, the more it becomes acceptable. And then your indifference is actually making it worse.
You're fueling it.
You're fueling it, exactly. And this sort of, it goes back to the verse about don't sing my praises if you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, from Amos. You can be decent and sinister, pious and sinful at the same time, and we all know examples of that, right? But that last verse, some are guilty, but all are responsible. We may not be the ones who are doing the actual killing. We may not be the ones who are literally oppressing another person, but we're responsible for the fact that other people are if we don't do anything about it. Right. Let's see. Okay, so yeah.
You can't have that New Yorker mentality of I'm staying in my lane.
Yeah. Or the what was it, Kitty Genovese, the example when the woman who was being killed in the courtyard and everybody saw it back in the 50s or 60s. Yeah, and nobody did anything about it.
I thought somebody else would take care of it.
Right.
Contagious,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Contagious apathy.
Yeah. So I think we jumped two because we already did that one. So again, this is another, doesn't get quoted as much, Rabbi Joachim Prince, who was, I think in America, I feel like his congregation was in somewhere in North Jersey. But he was originally from Germany. As it says here at the bottom, he was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime. So let's, but here he's specifically speaking as an American Jew, not as the survivor of the Holocaust, or he got out of there in time, but as an American Jew. Somebody want to start reading at the top there?
I speak to you as an American Jew. As Americans, we share the profound concern of millions of people around the shame and disgrace of inequity and injustice, which makes a mockery of the great American idea. As Jews, we bring this great demonstration in which thousands of us proudly participate, a twofold experience, one of the spirit and one of our history. In the realm of the spirit, our fathers taught us thousands of years ago that when God created man, he created him as everyone's neighbor. Neighbor is not a geographic term, it's a moral concept. It means our collective responsibility for the preservation of man's dignity and integrity. From our Jewish historic experience of 3,500 years, we say our ancient history began with slavery and the yearning for freedom. During the Middle Ages, my people lived for 1,000 years in the ghettos of Europe. Our modern history begins with the proclamation of emancipation. It is for these reasons that it's not merely sympathetic and compassion for the Black people of America that motivates us. It's above all and beyond all such sympathies and emotions, a sense of complete identification and solidarity born out of our own painful historic experience. When I was the rabbi of a Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things.
And actually, go to the next page. This continues to be him, just much larger print.
Yeah, that's good for my eyes.
Yeah.
The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, the most tragic problem is silence. The great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder. America must not become a nation of onlookers. America must not remain silent. Not merely Black America, but all America must speak up and act, from the president down to the humblest of us, and not for the sake of the Negro, not for the sake of the Black community, but for the sake of the image and the idea of that and the aspiration of America itself.
So in some ways, he's taking everything that we've just been looking at and bringing it into the present. What was then the present, 1963, and coming from, again, having lived through the rise of Nazism in Germany. Thoughts about this?
My mind is wandering, but it makes me wonder where we are today, that in the current status of anti-Semitism and whatever, many people, maybe most people, are not hiding. People are standing up and saying, no, I'm Jewish and you're not going to discriminate against me, and we're not going to tolerate the hatred and the whatever. Where I would argue 20, 30, in the 60s, there were a lot of people that would just hide. Who would, I mean, we have come to a different place.
Right.
And now, so I don't, what's different about this place? Why are we now willing to stand up and say, no, you're not going to discriminate against me?
Passage of time, adding security, but also that, like, the way the world has become so much smaller in the last 60 years.
Right.
Internet, international air travel, like everything that's just made us smaller as one human people enables you to kind of embrace where you're different too.
And being able to see some of it. I mean, if you think about it, part of the issue of supporting the civil rights movement came out of SNCC and some of the other organizations having a program of photography, of documentation of the negatives that they were seeing. And so part of that ability now to highlight those things
Yeah,
in
record
our,
everything.
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
record
previously.
everything allows us to see what's being done unjustly. On the other hand, we have a habit now, I think, to some extent, and I see it in young people especially, of documenting without action. And we've
Mhm.
gone too extreme to the documenting, but without action to follow it through.
Right.
And that worries me a lot, is that ability to want to document it, blast it on Facebook, throw it out there that you're such an awful human being is a problem if you're not like directly communicating that it's
Mhm.
what you're seeing is an awful thing, because that person might be able to change. You're not giving them that opportunity either.
Right.
So documentation without communication is not any better than silence, and in my opinion, a lot of times, I think it's actually worse than silence.
And
In a
now
lot of ways.
because we're documenting every story, every thread, everything's out there, and now we're at the point where everything's getting curated to us
Yeah.
in very specific streams that reinforce what we're already thinking,
Yeah.
so we lose the broadness of everything and get lost in the little details.
Right.
Yeah. And if we had another session of this, I would go into what's actually on the next page, the links that are on the next page, because I think, well, I have to say that again, a lot of these are all, I think, done, written, or published before October 7th of this year, which sort of changed so many things. But looking at the history of racism and fight for racial justice in our society, shouldn't it be topic? Should you
Which one do you
click
want
on
me
the
to
first? Just click on the first link.
I
Yeah.
also put them in the chat for anybody.
Okay. I just wanted to just show people these and urge people to look at them, because I think, the Reconstructionist movement, of which our congregation is a part, has really been looking at sort of what our responsibility, not only, what we did during the civil rights movement, but also what still needs to be done in our country in terms of racial justice. So, I urge you, we don't really have time to look through these now, and I had a feeling we wouldn't, but if you look, at the bottom of this screen, there are some videos from the trip that I think was, I know a group of Reconstructionist rabbis and Reconstructionists took to look at, what is the history and how we can remember what has happened to the African American community, and what can we do to make it, to continue the work. And I think right now, obviously our focus is so much on the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and what's happening in Israel, but I think also we can't forget, this is still an issue. So if we look at the next link was an article about, and this could be a whole session in and of itself, about the idea of reparations.
They spent a whole year talking about it. All the rabbis kind of basically said, this is what we're talking about this year. And
Right.
they did all sorts of reaching out to the communities and planning committees and all sorts of.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, sometimes you'll hear people say, well, why should we be giving reparations? Should we? And, we're speaking as a community where one of the few cases of financial reparations is for victims of survivors of the Holocaust. That, granted, people say, well, but slavery was so long ago, but it really wasn't when it comes down to it. So I think we need to, look at what is our nation's collective responsibility, not just in terms of fighting against racism today, but trying to make up for what happened, you know, in the past.
Equity.
Yeah, exactly.
It's,
yeah.
it's easy to say, we did that.
Mhm.
We were there, we did that.
It was the
It's
gold
done.
chair.
And just like with women's rights, well, we've got the vote, so it must be fixed.
Right.
Yeah.
Or we've
But
had a black president, so there's no more racism in America.
Right. It's all good.
Exactly.
You know, but the systemic issues are still there. You know, there are still organizations that, you know, don't hire women. Well, there's no candidates that are qualified.
Right.
You know, there's organizations that still don't hire people of color. Well, there's no one that's qualified.
Mhm.
Well, yeah, there's somebody that's qualified. You're just seeing what you want to see.
Right. Right. And then the last link, I mean, I urge people to look at these. These are all things you can look at on your own and read.
This will be on the website, Liz.
Yeah, I'll put it
Yeah.
in with the follow-up email too.
So that's Sandra in the middle there. And Rabbi
That was
Sandra
when she
Lawson.
got,
That was when she was ordained.
or-
And yeah, again, that, you know, she's working on also fighting racism within the Reconstructionist movement. I think, you know, within Judaism, you know, there's been a lot that's been written about Jews of color who still get treated. You know, somebody walks into a synagogue and assumes they're on the custodial staff.
Yeah.
Yes.
You know, or at a conference, you know, Mara Gad was talking about when she was a keynote speaker at the Reform Movement's conference a couple of years ago. She's a Jew, she's an African American Jew, and you know, she went up to get her badge, and they're like, "Oh well, Mara Gad, who's speaking, she needs to come and get the badge for herself." And she's like, because somebody was assuming that she was working for her or something. Like, no, I am Mara Gad. She had to show her ID. You know, I mean, on the one, you know, not because everybody, I mean, they should have to show their ID, but the assumption that she was working on was that she wasn't actually Mara Gad.
Tell that person to put toilet paper in the restroom.
Yeah. I mean, she talks about it, and Sandra also talks about, right, the number of times she's been in the synagogue, and even in a synagogue, dressed nicely, wearing a talit, and somebody assuming that she is an employee of the synagogue. Like, really? Anyway, so this is a whole other issue, but I felt like I wanted to.
That's a whole other issue too, because I mean, we have other issues that are similar. Tamara, not Tamara Cohen, the Rabbi, who's in charge of Reconstructionist Judaism.
Deborah
Waxman. Brain stopped all of a sudden. Deborah Waxman talks about the fact that she goes to conferences of all of the rabbinical leaders of the rabbinical movements, and she consistently has to introduce herself to the one Orthodox rabbinical leader, because he consistently doesn't believe that she's the leader of the Reconstructionist movement because she's a woman.
Right.
And I mean, it's like, you know, and you'd think that if the third time you have to introduce yourself, you say to the same person, they figure it out. But also, you know, I mean, then at which point, when do you know, start having to explain, well, that's my partner, you know, and that kind of stuff. It's these consistent mental blocks to anything that is.
It's inflexibility leading to erasure, and
it's
just
all these little
unacceptable.
microaggressions that people have that we just don't realize when people talk about microaggressions. They don't realize that that's what we're really talking about.
Right.
It's that consistent, when, you know, which do I have the spoons for today? Do I have the spoons to say that if I'm in my tali, I'm a Black Jew who belongs here? Then do I then have a problem when I go to introduce my partner, who's a white Jew who belongs there? And, you know, or you know, these other things. It's like.
And I think, you know, if Dr. King were still alive today, or Dr. Heschel, I mean, either of them would say, you know, these all oppressions are all connected. So when we're looking at the sort of to wrap up, when we're looking at all of these texts from the Jewish tradition, that, you know, we're applying them to racism and to civil rights, but, you know, civil rights are human rights, right? So we're talking about everyone. We're not just talking about the African American community. That's certainly what we're focusing on right now with Martin Luther King Day tomorrow. But you know, all of these communities, all of the communities that are in some way marginalized or minoritized. I mean, it's interesting. You know, we talk about you know, minorities, but I love the one of, you know, the term that's being used by some people within the Black community of people of color is global majorities,
Yes.
because they may be minorities here,
Yeah.
people of color, if you
People
expect,
that live in-
but globally they're the majority, we're the
Yeah.
minority,
Yep.
and it's going to be, you know, we know that within by 2040, I think it is, they say white
Less
people are going to be the minority if you take all of the non-white groups, people
Yeah.
identified as non-white together, Black, Hispanic, Asian, etc.
Yeah.
You know, we're going to be, you know, white people are going to be the minority, and it's going to be interesting and we are globally, but sort of it's going to be interesting to see
The
how that's
collective
responded
ego
to.
and how it will scale as
Yeah.
these change.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And I think it's something that we as Jews need to really connect with and identify with. If we are the white folks that have been mistreating everybody, how will that come back to us?
Good.
If we are the white folks that were thinking globally
Mhm.
and thinking in terms of these things, that comes back to us a different way.
Right.
And not necessarily just white folks, but in general, that idea that folks that treat others with respect of all kinds
Mhm.
are going to be treated with respect when they are the minority versus
Yeah.
Because our whiteness is so new.
our whiteness
We've
is
only been
new.
white for 80 years or so.
Jews. Yeah. I mean,
It's
Ashkenazi Jews.
yeah, and it's as a people
In
that
Europe,
has
they
been
still identify us as a separate race.
it's
Mhm. Yeah. So that's a whole other issue that we could
Yeah.
certainly look at another time, but I know it is 2:34, so we do need to wrap up. Is there anybody online want to add something? Because I know we've been
a
talking.
couple folks have said thank you and had to Loretta had to jump out early because she had another engagement. Ahava wanted to say thank you so much for the study and welcoming me amongst you. Toda Rabba, v'shuv tov.
Yes, thank you,
Oh.
Rabbi Steve. Thank you, Rabbi Steve, and everybody who participated. That was really a wonderful program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
I-
for participating.
I-
And I know that the links and stuff will be shared on the,
Mhm. They'll be in the follow-up email and they were in the
Wonderful.
chat too.
yeah.
And we will follow up again with the refugee Shabbat coming up soon as
February
well.
2nd.
That'll be the second.
And a potluck.
And a potluck if anybody's interested, but that's another opportunity to speak to how we treat our neighbors around the world.
Mhm.
And
And unrelated to this particular topic, but related to the general subject
Mhm.
of continuing education or adult education, whatever you want to call it. We don't have the date yet, but sometime in May or June, we are going to be discussing, it was requested we discuss the book God is a Verb.
Oh yeah, it'll be on the calendar at some point.
Yeah,
We
so
haven't
if you-
slated which month, but
Right,
spring.
so if you want to purchase God is a Verb by, oh my God,
Was the letter A is coming.
I know,
oh boy,
okay,
Well,
Google.
God is a verb. Yeah, we'll Google
got
it.
it, you know, if you want to purchase it and start reading it, it's a wonderful book. I actually haven't read it in like 20 years, so I look forward to go back to it.
David Cooper.
David
Thank
Cooper,
you.
yes,
So there
yes.
is an A.
There's an A in
A.
David.
Cooper,
Yeah.
yes, it's
All
his
right.
middle initial.
There we
Anyway,
go. Joey got it. Thank you.
Right, so if that's something, depending on how, it's not a long book, but it's something that people might want to get in the near future. I know.
Yeah.
I imagine there's an electronic version of it as well, but Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Sure.